Honourable Senators, I see that we have quorum. I declare the meeting in session. My name is Paul Massicotte. I'm a senator from Quebec, and I'm the chair of the committee. Today, we're conducting a meeting of the Standing Senate Committee on Energy, the Environment, and Natural Resources. I'd like to begin with a little reminder before asking and answering questions. I would like to ask the members and the witnesses in the room to please refrain from leaning in too close to the microphone or to remove your earpiece when doing so. This will allow us to avoid any sound feedback that could have a negative impact on the committee staff in the room and the interpreters. I ask my fellow committee members to introduce themselves, beginning on my right.
Merci. José Werner, Québec.
Julie Méville-Deschênes, Québec.
Judy White, Province of Newfoundland and Labrador.
Karen Sorensen, Alberta.
Marnie McBean, Ontario.
Andrew Cardozo from Ontario.
David Wells, Newfoundland and Labrador.
Rosa Galvez, Québec.
Today, the committee continues its examination of Bill C-226, an act respecting the development of a national strategy to assess, to prevent, and to address environmental racism, and to advance environmental justice. Before moving to our guests, I would like to ask the committee members if we could stay to discuss something, common concerns. Today, we have with us CanArctic Inuit Networks, Inc., Madeleine Redfern, Chief Operating Officer, Northern Director, Arctic 360. And also from Smith Law Droit, Incorporated, Liam Smith, lawyer. I would like to welcome you and to thank you for having accepted our invitation. 5 minutes are reserved for your opening remarks. The floor is yours, Ms. Redfern, followed by Mr. Smith.
To come before this committee and to share some of my thoughts and experiences and recommendations as it relates to environmental racism and environmental justice. In my life, I've worked and volunteered in a number of positions, including being on the board of EcoJustice, the president of Amauti, which is the Nunavut's Inuit Women's Association, director of Inuit Business Council. I was mayor for the city of Iqaluit for 2 terms, as well as the president of the Nunavut Association Municipality. And lastly, I want to say I was the executive director of the Kekitani Truth Commission that was led a historical inquiry into the policies and decisions along with their effects on Inuit from 1950 to 1975. I'm an Indigenous woman in tech, working in technologies with transformative potential in telecommunications, digital infrastructure, energy, and transportation. I have over 30 years of professional experience. I've witnessed environmental racism in many different forms. It takes all shapes and sizes. Some more obvious, at least from an Indigenous or Northern perspective, including from the Marine Mammal Protection Act and regulations, the Migratory Bird Act, Federal Wastewater System Effluence Regulation, national guidelines for hazardous waste landfills with respect to the distance of landfills to airports, and also as having to call a state of emergency as mayor when the water had insufficient water, and the challenges and the inability to get the necessary funding from either the territorial or federal government to address. At the same time, the city and the officials were threatened with fines and jail time, despite the fact that we were doing the best and we had very little resources. That's just to name a few. I've interacted with many other local and Indigenous leaders from within Nunavut, across the circumpolar north, Indigenous leaders in North America, South America, Africa, and what I've learned is that we often, as minorities, face the exact same problem, systemic discrimination, not just towards us as individuals, as a minority, but also the attitudes that are prevalent that go against our region, our communities, and our peoples. The level of disregard or disdain when we were bringing our issues to other levels of government was palatable. In my engagements and interventions with the United Nations on disaster risk mitigation and response, me and my fellow Indigenous leaders' recommendations to ensure that our people's perspectives, our knowledge, and our recommendations to ensure that we were included in the assessing, planning, and preparation for a disaster was often tokenized, but then disregarded. Despite providing numerous solid examples of the breadth and depth of our localized knowledge as climatic or environmental risks, but are also our people's way of adapting or mitigating, we might be invited, as I said earlier, but in the end, our contributions were often meaningless. As I said earlier, environmental racism comes in all forms and not always ways that are obvious. One is the lack of adequate infrastructure and the lack of recognizing or investing in our people to increase capacity, or the lack of funding in programs. It comes not only from federal regulations, but also the federal funding programs, federal policies that do not always fit or appropriate, or worse, put those of us who are minorities that are already marginalized even more at risk. The presumption that laws, policies, and programs are neutral can actually lead to an inequality and inequity. In a worst-case scenario, it may not be seen by intention to be racist, but by effect and outcome, it is. If the laws and policies and programs have a disproportionate negative impact, especially where, as I said earlier, we're most at risk, that is something that should be, considered. And because we can prove that there's often a direct correlation or causation based on racism that lead to these racist outcomes. How do we address this problem? Simple answer: inclusion. Meaningful participation of minorities throughout the process, both from within and not only about, those outside, but how one engages and where. Only members of the most marginalized or minority Indigenous peoples can or should represent themselves. I'm shocked by how frequently we minorities are represented by others and who advocate or speak on our behalf. Ask minorities what the barriers of meaningful participation are, and we'll tell you. We'll tell you what's needed and how to do things differently so that we are not just comfortably participating, but that we are actually respected and that our participation is reflected in the final product. So I thank you for the invitation to come speak to you about environmental racism and how we can achieve an environmental justice. As I was speaking to Liam earlier, the act itself, sort of indicates a good intention. The reality is that environmental racism or the outcomes or the interpretation of many pieces of federal legislation, federal policies, and federal programs, unfortunately, have the unintended consequence of having racist outcomes. So this act that's being proposed, is maybe an initial first good step. I hope it's not a hollow sort of act in of itself, but it needs to actually trigger how our federal department acts in so many different areas that have this environmental impact and can affect our lives positively or negatively. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Redfern. Monsieur Smith.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, good morning, Chair. Thank you very much for having invited me here to appear. It's the first time that I've appeared before a Senate committee, and it's an honor for me to be here. First of all, I will introduce myself in the Mi'kmaq language and in French, and then I will be speaking in English.
Smith, ni nuji gatak swallowet, de lewi unamagi, Mi'kmaqi. Bonjour, je m'appelle.
Hello, I'm Liam Smith. I'm a lawyer. I'm here today coming from Cape Breton in Nova Scotia. I have read the bill C-226. As a lawyer, I will be frank with you here. There's not a lot of matter in this bill, but I hope that what I can give you today as a witness are some of my thoughts in the way that this law would have an effect on Indigenous people.
But I am a lawyer, and since approximately 2013, my main interest and my main focus in my studies and now in my practice as a lawyer is in helping Indigenous nations, helping Indigenous people, and specifically helping Indigenous children and youth. I focused personally at the outset of my career on how to remedy youth Indigenous suicide, a really traumatic epidemic here across the country of Canada. Specifically, in my practice, we look at how we can use the law to remedy this issue, what solutions we can use within the legislative frameworks that we have here in Canada, within the constitutional law, to help Indigenous communities increase their capacity to intergenerationally transmit their language, cultures, and identities. Canada has a negative history of environmental racism. From my perspective as a witness, that is a fact. I can speak personally of my experience as a Nova Scotian and some of the deleterious environmental legacies we have in Nova Scotia. As I said, I am not an Indigenous person, but I am going to try to shed some light on how environmental racism impacts Indigenous peoples and also other minority societies within Canada. I am grateful to be appearing next to my colleague Madeleine Redfern here. She is an excellent wealth of knowledge on this issue, and it's really an honor for me to be here today. So, en tant qu'avocat, j'ai lu le projet de loi, il n'y a pas beaucoup.
As a lawyer, I read the bill, and there's not a look. It's a plan to make a plan, and that's really too bad to my mind, but it wasn't in the right direction. To my mind, the objective of this goal shows a good intention to do something, because this legacy is disastrous for Indigenous people. In Nova Scotia, we have the ASEG site, also known in English as Boat Harbour, near the Pictou First Nation. And I'm going to give you a little bit of context about Boat Harbour.
350 acres beside Pictou Landing First Nation. It is a legacy contaminated site, and I understand it is one of the impetuses that bring about this project, this bill. ASEG is planned to undergo a massive remediation, and the deleterious environmental legacy of ASEG is fundamentally tied to Pictou Landing First Nation, a community of approximately 500 Mi'kmaq or Innu people. They traditionally would have used ASEG as the site where they performed ceremonies, told stories, gathered medicines, hunted, fished, and basically survived from its ecologies. In the early 1920s in Nova Scotia, the Canadian federal and provincial governments permitted a craft pulp and paper mill and later a chlor-alkali chlorine fabrication plant to discharge approximately 85 million liters or 75,000 cubic meters of wastewater effluent into the medicine chest for this First Nation. Now, the environmental studies that are being undertaken to execute the remediation of this site have established that there are contaminants such as cadmium, mercury, lead, chlorinated dioxins and furans, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, petroleum hydrocarbons, and zinc in quantities that all exceed the Canadian Council of Ministers of Environment's probable effect guidelines for posing severe ecological health risks. This is one example of many present across Canada where minority groups, Indigenous, also I can speak briefly of some knowledge I have on the African Nova Scotian issue where there are dumps historically located next to African Nova Scotian communities. And this is a pattern that is inculcated within Canada's legacy of colonialism. And as a brief example that I can provide as well, comme vous savez, je parle en français, je suis un anglophone.
As you know, I speak French. I'm an Anglophone. I learned French with Acadian people with whom I lived for 10 years. I know the Acadian people's stories, and now I teach at the law faculty at the University of Moncton. I teach Indigenous people's law and also rights coming from treaties. Thank you, Senator. When the Acadians were deported in 1755, about 8 years after the Canadians won the battle in Quebec with the capitulation of France in 1763, the Acadians were allowed to return to their territories, but only in places that weren't suitable for farming. They had to live on rocky lands. They had not previously been fisher folk, but then they had to make a living from the sea because the place where the English allowed them to go were in remote areas or areas that were distant from their previous homelands. They weren't allowed to come back home. And that's one of the examples that demonstrates for me that there is a pattern of trying to cut or to break the connection of minority peoples to their lands. And it's the same thing that we see for Indigenous people.
It is a legacy of environmental racism, deliberately severs connection to traditional territory. And if there was one thing I would like to see in this project, this bill, C-226, is possibly for First Nations as a lawyer, even in the preamble, a reference to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That, as a lawyer, would be something I can use. Currently, as the project of law currently stands, there's not really anything that I could litigate or anything that I could use to even help my clients. But if as a principle of legislative redaction or legislative writing, you have to have a relatively sound knowledge of all the corpus of legislation on a subject. And just something as simple as a reference in a preamble to UNDRIP or to the new Act Respecting First Nations, Inuit, Métis Children and Family Services, which recognizes connection to traditional territory as one of the factors that must be considered in determining the best interests of Indigenous children. That would be something that is actually tangible, that it's nothing more than an insertion into a preamble, which generally just helps us understand the context or the purpose of a bill, but it's something that would show why this bill is here and why there is a solid intention from the government, from the Parliament, and from Senate to want to do something to help the affected communities. In my notes, I have a few other examples of environmental racism that I can put on the record. Madawaska First Nation in New Brunswick, the effluent pipeline crossing the reserve leaked dumping of pulp effluent coming in from Maine into Madawaska First Nation. Africville, like I said, an African Nova Scotian community with a dump located right next to the place where everyone lives. Other First Nations in Atlantic Canada are forced to build their infrastructure, even under the new CHRT 41 orders, which ordered Canada to stop the discrimination against Indigenous children in care and ensure that it never happens again. We're still seeing the effects of Canada's environmental racist legislation and policy, and frankly, just the paternalism, trying to have First Nations either build on dumps or have very onerous hurdles that need to be overcome with respect to environmental permitting before capital infrastructure can be built in First Nations. A small subdivision in Eskazoni First Nation was also built alongside a dump from the colonization area. Projects requiring environmental assessment only combat environmental racism to a certain extent, but they are still inculcated with a lot of the colonial values that come with Canada's colonial history. And now in the UNDRIP era, and even from a First Nations perspective in the post-1982 era, where Aboriginal and treaty rights are now recognized and affirmed as an integral part of the Constitution of Canada, I think such policies and such actions are fundamentally inconsistent with the purpose of Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. So I hope that today I can provide some information that will help the Senate do their job, and I'm here to help however I can. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Merci, thank you very much. On procède aux questions.
Thank you. We will move to questions. Senator Sorensen.
Hello, Ms. Redfern. Nice to see you again. I've heard you speak before. As noted, very impressive career, and I thought I should mention that there's a seat on the Senate bit out of Nunavut. The application's online. And Mr. Smith, welcome. We're really quite a nice group of people. And I want to say, I certainly understand your comments about what does the bill actually say, and Senator McCallum, who's the sponsor of the bill, would speak very passionately to that. She's not here today. I don't know if any of the other senators can speak more to it, and Elizabeth May's intent as well. But I think you said it correctly. It's to show good intention, and I think from my perspective, even the term environmental racism is not a common known term. So when I talk to people about what I'm doing in my committees that aren't anywhere near this place, they're like, oh, environmental racism. Like it's this new concept. So I believe it has merit, but I agree there's no meat on the bones at this point. So to that point, I'll ask this question to both of you. There's an emphasis on consultation in the bill, as there should be. Can you give us an idea of what you think those consultations should look like? And how do you think community-based organizations and community members can best collaborate and advise the federal government in the development of a national strategy? And honestly, the word consultation is used so often. I wish we had some formula as to what that should be. When you say to people, did you consult? Yes. I don't even know what that means half the time. So I do want both your opinions on what consultation should look like to get some more detail in the bill.
So I agree with you. Consultation has a important and distinct different meaning than engagement or just an information session. Often they are confused. Consultation for me is that you're actually, for it to be meaningful, you're listening, you're learning, and whatever you're proposing is being adapted as a result of that engagement. Too often, in my experience, consultation is actually just an information session. Thank you, we're here, it's rote, we've listened to you, but we're actually not, we're still going to do what we're going to do. And it's a tick box exercise. As an Indigenous person who's from Nunavut, I would say is that the challenge is that a lot of our community members are fatigued from never-ending level of consultation. Also, in even major projects, what we find or initiatives is that our communities are not provided information beforehand other than the date and place in a public venue of where to show up, if they do show up, and that it's very formal rather than actually sort of something that is much more comfortable. The community members or groups are often also not provided any resources to prepare for consultation. So access to lawyers or people who work in the policy field to really understand what's being proposed and being able to therefore present and prepare a formal response as to why and how any initiative that is being proposed, could or should proceed and what adjustments are necessary. So that is definitely a big challenge and problem, is that more often than not, since we have a legacy of decades of very inadequate and unacceptable level of consultation, is a lot of our people are just not even prepared to be consulted anymore.
Yeah, thank you for that. Mr. Smith, anything to add?
Yes, thank you. So, as I mentioned in my introduction, I teach Aboriginal and Treaty Rights this semester at the University of Moncton's Law Faculty. I teach on the duty to consult and accommodate. I can perhaps provide a little bit of where that comes from, the framework and how it works and how it should be implemented. I'll start from the outset by saying, yes, I do think the actions undertaken in this bill likely triggered the duty to consult and accommodate. It's a very low threshold. But it helps to understand why there is a constitutional duty to consult and accommodate. It comes from this constitutional principle called the honor of the Crown. It's related to the fiduciary relationship between the Crown and First Nations people, but it is distinct and it gives rise to distinct obligations at law incumbent upon the Crown. And these are constitutional obligations. So we first had the Supreme Court of Canada tell us that the duty to consult and accommodate exists in 2004, in 2005, in a trilogy of decisions starting with the Haida logging case. And the way that it works is if there is a governmental action, even a planned governmental action, which risks having some sort of impact on asserted or proven Aboriginal treaty rights, then there is a constitutional obligation, a positive obligation incumbent upon the Crown to consult and accommodate about how this will impact the rights. And there's really a large spectrum that this can fall on. And there's usually two factors that must be considered when determining where on the spectrum the obligation to consult and accommodate falls. The first factor that the Supreme Court of Canada tells us must be considered is the strength of the asserted or proven Aboriginal right. The second factor is the possible prejudicial effect of the planned or government action impacting on these Aboriginal and treaty rights. So if, for example, there is already an established, say, Aboriginal title to a piece of territory, that is a strong Aboriginal right. And if the planned governmental action is going to have a severe prejudicial effect on this established Aboriginal right, then we would understand that the obligation to consult and accommodate would fall on the deep consultation side of the spectrum. And what that practically implicates is that there must be consultation. It must be a fully fleshed out consultation. It can't just be a community engagement session where pamphlets are passed out and then everyone goes home and the project goes ahead anyway. It could even require that the Crown provide funding for lawyers, as was mentioned, but also potentially independent scientific minds to verify the evidence being put before the First Nation. And if on the other side of the spectrum, it's just a light consultation, we would understand those types of circumstances arise when there's a asserted but not yet proven Aboriginal right, possibly even an incidental right that's required to exercise the Aboriginal right, and it's not exactly on the severe end of the spectrum with respect to these Aboriginal rights, and the planned government action might only have a minimal effect on it. And in those types of consultations, there could just be, like I said, a community engagement session, or it could just be keeping the First Nations informed. So that's kind of the legal framework on how it works. But now with the United Nations and the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in Canada, we have this new concept that ostensibly goes further than consultation, and it's free, prior, informed consent. So in this case, with this bill, yes, I imagine that considering the First Nations, even those with Aboriginal title, were impacted by in the Canada's colonial legacy of environmental racism. So there is definitely, in my opinion, a triggered and duty to consult and accommodate. It depends on how much the government action may impact certain Aboriginal rights, such as the right to hunt, the right to fish, possibly even Aboriginal title, or as I mentioned in the outset, the right to transmit your identity to future generations. And if connection to traditional territory is an integral part of identity, it seems like there is a very strong case that the government would have a duty to consult and accommodate when it's planning to undertake action such as this bill sets out. I hope that helps.
Yeah, very much. Thank you, sir.
And it's the honor of the Crown.
Thank you. Yeah.
Senator White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two questions, one for each of the panelists. Thank you very much for being here today. I certainly enjoyed your testimony. My first question is for Madeleine, Monsieur Redfern. When it comes to environmental risks and promoting environmental justice, we know, challenges for the communities in the north are compounded due to the impacts of climate change being more severe. I think, this year it's nearly 4 times faster than the rest of the world. So, and as well, the increased mining activity and the lack of basic infrastructure. I guess I'm wondering, you indicated that this bill has good intentions, but is these intentions good enough for the Indigenous communities in the Arctic? And if not, do you have any recommendations on what we should be adding or amending?
So in my experience, when I was mayor and now in the private sector, quite a number of federal contracts or contribution agreements actually require us to assess, a climate change lens consideration. I found that sometimes it was difficult because we had such limited resources at the municipal level, and I would conjecture the same exists for First Nations bands and nations. Being able to actually, we know what the climate change reality and changes are upon us, but being able to even present that evidence in a way that satisfied, the bureaucrats was often challenging. And I'll give you a specific example. So when I stated that I had to declare a state of emergency for a capital city in Canada because we had insufficient water to meet the needs of our community for that year, and now actually that state of emergency is now, I think, in its sort of 7th year, and it's ongoing. And the amount of, times that I had to try to contact different levels of government, whether territorial and federal, especially the Department of Environment and Climate Change, you would think would be the most sympathetic and, just bounced around like a ping pong ball, just going from one person to another because that program didn't fit, that program didn't fit, that program didn't fit, that program. And literally, I remember Northwest Territories, I think their municipal association determined that there were almost 60 different programs, but almost all of them were focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is important, but didn't meet our current immediate need, which was climate change related, not having enough precipitation. And coming across bureaucrats who are like, no, the Arctic is melting, so you got lots of water. And I'm like, excuse me, and having to prove, the precipitation levels from, over the years was actually why and how we were, dealing with the climate change crisis. So, it just is more obstacles, and then necessary. Literally, we were able to get just only, a tiny percentage, I would say maybe if not even 10% of what actually financially we were needed to deal with a solution. For just that year, which was to buy some hoses and get some technical engineers and try to draw water from another lake to fill our reservoir. And that was that year. And at the same time, trying to have enough resources to actually do our water license application. And being faced with, as I said earlier, these fines and, faced with sort of, even threatened with jail time. And we're like, we need help. We're so, we're dealing with a crisis and you're not helping. So with respect to, what can, and should be done with respect to helping, northern or remote and Indigenous communities is instead of, sort of pushing us off when we need help, and we're, and we can prove that we need help, is sort of saying, okay, well, let's meet and figure out how to help you, so that we can actually get to the solution where your community has adequate water. And so, to kind of ask, it's a very complicated, answer to, because it's so multifaceted, and that's just one example. I can, Liam and many others that I would say, from across the north, you talk to any mayor, you talk to any Indigenous leader, they will tell you, immediately what they're dealing with on the environmental issues, and the fact that they just simply usually cannot find, funding, resources, or the solution, from any level of government to get them to where they need to get to. So it's so prevalent. This act, is good intention, but it's so pervasive, where environmental racism happens on all levels, that even just sort of trying to see, or trigger and make people put their mind to it. And if someone says, hey, I've got an environmental problem, we don't tend to call out the R word, it's racist. But I think that we're starting to become more comfortable in sort of actually, saying it is racist, because our people are feeling the negative impacts as a result.
Thank you. And my next question then is to Mr. Smith, and I know this is your first time presenting. I think you did a great job. I just want to say that. And thank you for laying out the consultation and duty to consult, but this bill requires the minister to hold a consultation process with any interested persons, bodies, organizations, and communities. And I'm wondering, what would that look like practically speaking, and how can we ensure a comprehensive consultation process as it relates particularly to the inclusivity of Indigenous peoples? So do you have any recommendations of how we can promote that and ensure Indigenous communities and make sure the consultation process is as inclusive as promised?
Thank you for the question, Senator White. I had mentioned the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as having several solutions. To answer your question, 2 articles in particular come to mind. Article 19, I'll call it UNDRIP. Article 19 of UNDRIP requires free, prior, informed consent before states implement legislative or administrative measures that impact or affect Indigenous rights. Article 32 of UNDRIP requires free, prior, informed consent before states approve any project which affects Indigenous peoples' lands, territories, or other resources. And for me, interesting, there's a Supreme Court of Canada decision released this year on February 7th, 2024. It was a reference out of the Court of Appeal of Quebec on the Act Respecting First Nations, Inuit, Métis Children and Family Services. And that is an interesting piece of legislation because it's the first time the Parliament has ever legislated to say that Section 35 rights include rights to self-government or self-determination, including self-government. The Supreme Court of Canada did not tell us if that is correct or not, but it said that Canada has taken this position. It is now bound by the honor of the Crown to act in a way that is consistent with that position until a court tells us otherwise, if Section 35 includes self-government rights. So that said, in this legislation, practically, Canada has already taken the position in law that Section 35 rights include rights to self-government. So a very simple thing that could be done in this piece of legislation is to include a clause recognizing that Indigenous nations have authority to enact or implement Indigenous laws on environment and on any assessment processes. So really, there's often a paternalistic conception that Indigenous peoples do not have capacity, et à mon avis, c'est fausse. Il y a beaucoup de capacité.
To my mind, that's erroneous. There's a lot of Indigenous capacity that Indigenous people have, and it's often ignored.
To make their own decisions rather than, as my colleague Madeleine Redfern has mentioned, having a bureaucrat who has never been there impose on them what they think they need. You empower them to make the decisions for themselves, and they will take you the way they want to go, as opposed to trying to lead them to water by dangling a bit of money in front of them, saying in order to get this money you have to do X, Y, Z, and then once you do X, Y, and Z, there's 6 other questions that have to be answered. So it's more of working in reconciliation and partnership as nation to nations than trying to impose upon them what they have to do, in my personal opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions, and if you don't mind, I want to go back to square one on the concept of environmental racism. And I say this because as I observed this field, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there was a sense that there is something called racism and we've got to deal with it. Somehow after the year 2000, there seems to be a pushback and a questioning of racism. So I find that when we talk about racism in general, one has to go back to square one, explain it in clear and simple terms, and explain that it's real. You talked a bit about this. I think Madeleine Redfern, and I'm paraphrasing you here, but you said something to the effect that it's not necessarily a stated intention; it's by effect. So I wonder if you could explain that a bit more. And I just want to add one more point in terms of context. I see the same kind of discussion happening in the environmental field, where we're having these discussions about climate change and carbon, and people don't know, people have forgotten what the problem with carbon was and why are we doing this whole thing. So sometimes I think it's important to go back. It's not a bad thing to go back to square one and explain these concepts again. But environmental racism is a newer term. So I wonder if you could explain it a little more, not just for us, but for the average person out there who is raising an eyebrow at the term.
So I'm going to give you 2 historical but still ongoing effects of environmental racism. So in the 1970s, there was a big push to ban seal hunts. And even, now what we have is that there is recognition of the value and the need for Indigenous seal hunts, but the market has been killed. So that has resulted in, a real economic impact on my people. There's an abundance of seals to the point that we're talking about, 6 million plus. So we are seriously outnumbered by seals than people in the north. It's people become very emotional and passionate about a cause. They are sometimes misinformed. And again, the intention was, to save the very cute little white furry baby seals. And, for the most part, our people hunt seals, and it's an important part of our diet. My 100-mile diet looks very different than that of Ottawa, Toronto, Winnipeg. You know, our diets are seals, caribous, whales, and polar bears. Again, you know, I remember not that long ago, there was intense, you know, sort of advocacy to, you know, based on climate change to save the polar bears, and that by 2025, which is actually next year, that all polar bears would basically be, you know, gone because of climate change. And yet that's, you know, thankfully not the case. There's more polar bears than less. And so you know, evidence-based decision-making is really important, you know, consideration. The Migratory Bird Act, you know, thankfully we have an exemption in our land claim that allows our people to harvest birds effectively year-round. But, you know, the impact in the 1950s of that act is that, you know, birds could be hunted in the fall when they were migrating back down south, and they were, but our people were not allowed to hunt or harvest the birds when they come to our region, which happens to be in the spring and the summer. So again, you know, the impacts of those types of legislation, which actually for the most part remain in place, and even though we have the land claim agreement that constitutionally trumps any law that violates our rights, I can tell you that since 1999, with the creation of our territory, there's been a number of our people who've been charged for violating the marine mammal regulations, or been charged for, you know, violating the Migratory Bird Act. Because what happens is that government, you know, officials, they take their piece of legislation as the Bible. They don't take our territory, our land claim agreement as the Bible, and they don't care that it states that our ways and our laws trump theirs. And so then you have, you know, our people are forced to go, you know, to court in a quasi-criminal circumstance to try to assert their rights. And I've seen, you know, our hunters try to sort of, you know, even plead guilty just to get rid of the charges, because the process of going through court is so traumatic and so stressful. It takes years. And I remember one judge actually just sort of saying, no, you've got a constitutional right. You got a land claim right. I reject your plea. And repeatedly over 2 years. Thankfully, in that one of those whale cases where someone was hunting without a tag, even though our land claim states that there's supposed to be no sort of, I'm trying to think of the word, any barrier to being able to exercise our rights, and that effectively a tag is a barrier. And it turned out that the marine mammal regulation, the numbers that were stated for a whale quota in those communities of the Kivalliq, Taloyuak, Joe Haven, that's the Kittimiut, had been set, you know, from over 30 years ago. And those numbers were just grabbed, you know, from nowhere. And that there was no scientific or evidence-based reason to limit the whale hunt to the numbers that they were limited to. And so charging our whalers, our hunters, so that they could feed their families, you know, was thankfully deemed, you know, by the judge as the evidence collected was incorrectly obtained, and threw it out on that technicality, but rather than our constitutional right. So, you know, I've answered this question in a very long, circuitous way, and my apologies, but it just speaks to, you know, a lot of these laws, especially federal, because whales are federally protected, as are our polar bears. They come from a southern urban, you know, not European sort of values than ours. So yes, I understand the value and the importance of polar bears and whales from, you know, that perspective, because they're, you know, they're so important, but they're important to us too. But we hunt them sustainably. And we hunt them because it is part of our culture. We hunt them because we need to feed our families. It is highly nutritious. 1 ounce or one, you know, square inch of whale skin is the same nutritional vitamin C value as an orange. You know, I love Alaska. They show the nutritional value of all their country food like it looks like what you would find on a carton of juice. So the impacts of these laws are basically because they put our people at risk of being criminals. They put our people at risk because they get charged, even though we have those constitutionally protected treaty rights, because you have bureaucrats that don't know, don't care, and those laws haven't been amended to comply with our laws, to comply with our treaty. And so when you have that conflict, as I said, that conflict just harms our people.
Go ahead.
Question, time for one more?
Very good. Supplementary, go ahead.
Okay, supplement. So the other issue that we have to deal with bills is, and this is sort of an administrative issue, but when a bill comes to us from the House of Commons, if we amend it, it has to go back to the House of Commons because both houses have to pass the exact same law. So there's always the conundrum we face of, the Senate, by the way, amends about 50% of the bills that come before us, which is way up from like 1 or 2% prior to 2015. The conundrum, though, is if we amend anything and send it back, there's always a possibility it gets lost and doesn't make it back, and then it goes away. So the judgment call we have to make is it worth going for that perfection, or is it worth going with something that's pretty good and moving it along? And given that this is a framework to actually make the laws, do you think we should go with this as it is and get moving, or is it worth taking the risk of?
And your question is addressed to whom?
To either of you.
That is a judgment call I really can't make. I see the practical impact of that. I usually, in my personal experience, if I'm going to do something, I try to do it right the first time. This law doesn't do much at all. So, as you mentioned in your question, Senator, should we get going? I don't really think this goes very far unless there are amendments made.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Sénatrice Miville-Deschênes.
Senator Miville-Deschênes.
Here, it's very, very enlightening. Thank you, Mrs. Redfern, for your very concrete example. This talks to me, I understand. And thank you, Mr. Smith, for your engagement. It's quite powerful. So I'm a very pragmatic senator. We see here a lot of frameworks, bills of that nature going through. They are very symbolic in a way. You know, it's a way of shedding light on a real problem. We do it for a different sickness. We do it for all kinds of things. And I'm always wondering what happens at the other end, because we have rarely feedback of what's happening. So, you know, to continue on what my colleague is saying, you know, you're saying that we should, for example, put the La Déclaration des Droits des Peuples Autochtones in the preamble. So, from what I understand, preamble are not law, and it cannot be. So you're a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. So I'd like to hear you. You know, is it really? Will it really change the nature of this framework, which basically depends on the goodwill of people to put the declaration up there? Yes, I think I'll stop there because there's many questions. And both, I think, for, you know, the idea of, is this bill, you know, is it better, this bill that you say is the first good step, but, or start over, which seems to me at this point, you know, difficult.
I suppose, thank you, Senator, for the question, that I can start by perhaps shedding a little bit of light on the purpose of a preamble. In Canada, nous privilégions une interprétation téléologique, or a purpose of interpretation of legislation.
Of teleological interpretation of legislation.
For a reason that it's remedial. Usually that requires the courts to go into an exercise to evaluate what is the purpose of legislation. The Interpretation Act of Canada allows the preamble, specifically Section 13 of the Interpretation Act, The preamble is instructive as to the purport and object of a certain piece of legislation. So there is that, and it's very useful for lawyers to know what is the purpose when we're arguing things, so that we can say, this is what the law was intended to do, this is why maybe an action is falling short of attaining its purpose. And I will maybe change slightly to say that in international public law through the United Nations system, preambles have a whole different weight in terms of its interpretive value. The way that the UN works is usually things flow up through committees to the General Assembly, and when enacted or declared through the General Assembly, it's at the committee stage where they insert certain sections into the preamble. So when you look at UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, the preamble, while it may not be law, it has more force than a standard preamble within Canadian legislation or even in provincial legislation. Preambles are very valuable and not to be discredited.
Redfern, on the larger question of does that matter, or is it one more promise?
What I would maybe add to what Liam has said, because I'm in full agreement, and I do have a law degree, and I did clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada. So yes, they often, lawyers are arguing or putting forward their own positions as to what the purpose of specific legislation is. But I would say it goes beyond that. It's not just a political or a legal indication or intention of the bill. It also actually, for the most part, if it's working properly, is that it is also guiding those that actually have to implement the law. So civil servants, but it also indicates to civil society, who the law is being impacted, and that might be businesses, it might be, individuals. Why, this law is important, and what is the intended outcome. And so it speaks to that. In the absence of having something like UNDRIP in the preamble, I would say, is that it indicated to everyone that it wasn't that important because it's absent. So it takes other meaning. That it's just broad and societal values. If you actually incorporate, the recognition that this is targeted to ameliorate or remediate, that we recognize that there are minorities, and including Indigenous minorities, that are negatively impacted by environmental racism, and allows those people who read the bill, who have to actually make the bill, be more than what it currently is, that it really is an issue that this, government has recognized needs to be addressed. Do we start over? I would probably say not, but can we improve what we currently have? Yes, but I am always in belief that everything in life, every piece of legislation, every policy can and should be improved. And I remember the Norwegians, who often are touted to, have such a perfect system, are saying, no, everything changes and evolves. And as a result, you constantly have to put your mind to it and assess, evaluate, which includes external evaluation, because the problem about internal evaluation is that we tend to presume that we are good people trying to do good things, and therefore with good intentions are going to come at good outcomes. Reality is that often is not the case. Good intentions, what do they say, is paves the way to hell. I think that's the kind of what I remember, how it's the hell is paved with good intentions. But the only people who can tell you where it's not working the way you intended are those that are being negatively impacted. So that engaging them and feeling uncomfortable, which is so un-Canadian. It's the most defining thing of being Canadian, is do not make anyone feel uncomfortable. So, but we need to actually allow, ourselves to feel uncomfortable, because that's the only way we address the problems.
Quick one, please.
Is the notion of environmental racism in UNDRIP or not? Very short.
I would say that it recognizes that racism is prevalent in society and within government, and it attempts to address, inherent racism
But
in
this-
all its provisions. Environmental racism, it recognizes that environmental racism is a problem.
It's written? It's written?
Not specifically environmental racism in that way, but I would say there's clear indication that it's trying to address environmental racism.
Merci.
Senator Galvez, and after that will be Senator Wells, after that will be Senator.
Senator Galvez, then Senator Wells, and Senator McBee.
I'd like to just say that I have my own question, but I have a question from Senator McCallum. So if you allow me, I will ask my question.
Is that where you're coming from?
No, it's no. Yeah, thank you. Yes. Yeah, I usually try to take advantage of the opportunities, but not in this case. So if you allow me, I will.
Go ahead.
Okay. So, oh my God. Okay. First time I heard about environmental racism and environmental justice, it was in 2005 when Katrina hit New Orleans. Okay, I think that that's considered as the ground zero for environmental justice, and the fact that we didn't call it environmental racism like that. I mean, it was obvious, and it was a matter of transparency and lack of communications, because I work on that case, and the U.S. Army knew, the U.S. government knew, the mayors and the local people, they knew, the petroleum companies knew, the banks knew, the insurance knew, everybody knew that that was a cancer alley where very, very low income, predominantly Black Americans were living there. And what fall after that was even worse. Because it was not just the fact that Katrina erased everything, but they expulsed them, everybody, from that place in order to create more petroleum plants. There was already 125 petroleum companies in there. So I know that the terms may sound, new, and these, I understand that, but actually this is happening, as you have brilliantly show that this exists so long ago. Just want to make clarification and for your understanding that despite that this bill is called C, meaning coming from the other place, it starts here in the Senate. And as senators, we have to be very creative in order not to move money. And so you are right, absolutely right, and this is, we all face this, that we cannot move money, and so therefore people consider that our bills don't have meat or don't have grabbing, or no, what do you call it? Anyways. Grip, because we cannot move money. But that's what I'm saying, we have to be very creative, and we have to put the things. So before you came, there were other witnesses, and I made 3 suggestions, but I really want to have your opinion on that. We can put meat in there by, yes, putting in the preamble the reference to existing laws. That doesn't create money, it exists there, and these bills have their own budget. So one is UNDRIP, the other is the SIPA, and the other is the environmental impact assessment, the modernization. So these 3 are there, we passed them. So I think that at the point we can add, whereas the government of Canada has passed this. The other thing that I raised.
There's a question on the
Yes, of course, I want them to tell me yes or no.
It's from Senator McCallum.
Yeah, exactly, yes. It's the preamble of my question, which you knew that it's the soul. Okay. Second point, and I am asking if these can be amendments. That's my question. The second point is that there is a differentiation that needs to be made between the legacy sites and the prevention of the new sites. We cannot melt both of them in the same pot because they are completely different. There are issues, there are already the Nazi Grassy Narrow, there are so many places already, the Chippewa one, and they're already existing place, and then there is the issue with the prevention of pollution. And my third thing is that we haven't expressed wishes of outcomes. goals and not reporting on this progress. So, of course, the bill is not mine, and of course, I cannot assume the leadership on that, but I would like you to comment on these 3 points. Thank you, Chair, for your patience and your indulgence and your comprehension.
So I would actually say, from an Indigenous and Northern perspective, environmental racism is something that our people instantly, felt and understood to be problematic from the first point of contact with our Government of Canada officials, usually the RCMP, from the 1950s. Because it was regarding sort of the imposition and the enforcement of those laws, whether it was, being able to hunt birds out of season, whether it was able to feed our dogs country food. What else were we going to feed them? I don't know. Not being able to hunt in protected areas like parks, and not being able to trade, sell, or gift, country food, and that all we were able to procure was, subsistence food to prevent starvation. So I would say is that while environmental racism as a terminology is now sort of understood, or coming to be understood, is we've felt it for decades. So I'm not entirely sure what the question was. My apologies. But I just wanted to say is that we have definitely not only felt it in the past, we continue to feel it today.
To the first point, with respect to amendments, environmental racism, often we discuss it through a bit of a different dialogue, and that is protection against discrimination. Section 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms provides that every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to equal protection, equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and in particular without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical inability. In law, we call those the enumerated grounds. There are other analogous grounds that are recognized as grounds for discrimination. So, if there can be references to other law in order to strengthen this bill, Section 15 of the Charter is a very good starting point. It already is Canada's framework for addressing racism in a prevention-based way. Yes, there's a lot of environmental legacy, contaminated legacy sites. There has to be remediation done. There's other legislation that can work on that. Here, in terms of preventing future legislation, to recognize that there has been a disproportionate impact on minority communities, vulnerable groups, and even impoverished people. You could also indicate that they may benefit from charter protection so that they don't have, where I come from, we had the most polluted site in North America, the Sydney tar ponds. It was a coal and steel plant, coke ovens, and it created massive, 2 lakes filled with black sludge right next to a black community. And also it was where all the immigrants came in that worked in the coal mines in Cape Breton and in the steel plants. And this was until the early 2000s, so there was almost 80 years of deleterious environmental legacy. And the reason it was placed where it was is because it was positioned beside communities that didn't have the means, maybe didn't have the knowledge to fight it. And at the time, it was more economically viable for industry. So at a certain point, you have to realize that often these places are put where they are because it's cheaper, it's the cost of doing business, it's more economic for those companies, and sometimes they might even rather just pay the fine than lose on the investment risk. You have to get out ahead of that by saying this might be discriminatory unless you've done all the required steps through the environmental assessment process, which I know there's also room for amelioration there, but it's a work in progress as well. For your third point on the wishes of outcomes, I would suggest that, I know I've read this bill, it's going to create a committee to study it, and there will possibly be a committee that evaluates outcomes. I would suggest incorporating the communities that are most affected in the design of the metrics against which the outcomes will be evaluated. It's not going to be a bureaucrat from Ottawa or anywhere really, independent assessor from Toronto that knows how this impacts communities that are affected. Bring them in to design the evaluation metrics.
Thank you very much. Senator Wells.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for your presentation so far. I have a question, and it's on the bill itself. In our note, it says the national strategy must include measures to advance environmental justice and address environmental racism, which may include, there's a number of things written, but one of the things is compensation for individuals or communities. Who would be responsible for that compensation? Would it be the companies that have the deleterious effect in the environment, or would it be the government which would control the regulator?
Well, that's a definitely difficult question to answer because there's just so much historical and current sort of environmental racism. So who's on the hook for Giant Mine? Well, the company no longer exists, so the government of Canada is trying to remediate the arsenic in Yellowknife to a cost of $1 billion plus, probably way more than whatever, most of the benefits of that mine, procured over that time. Who's responsible for all the, the remediation requirements of the old U.S. Sort of military sites, of which, one was remediated in my community. We still have an old metal dump. And jurisdictionally, there's been huge disagreements between the municipality, the territorial government, and the federal government who's responsible. And all I see is, sort of those piles of toxic waste being moved around, and worse yet, some of the soil is actually being, distributed into my community for roads or ground soil for base of building, houses and such like. So some of it is going to be business if they're around, but the problem is that even most businesses will say, well, we were compliant with the regulations or the law at that time. So, whether it is the sludge of the 2 lakes that have been polluted, there probably was some government participation that allowed the company to choose those locations and put their waste there. So, I would conjecture is that there's a lot of, existing problems. Who's responsible is one of the questions that the committee could assess, but more often than not, you're not going to find a lot of existing businesses for the legacy problem sites. For the current ones, again, business may prefer to pay a fine, but they got approved to do the work that they did through, more often not, even existing regulation.
Yep. Mr. Smith?
Thank you. I agree entirely with my colleague, Madeleine Redfern. The first principle that comes to mind is one that's already enshrined in Canadian environmental law, and that's the polluter pays principle. From an individual perspective, it's often extremely hard to establish causality, and that is to say, from an individual to claim prejudice or damages, it's very hard to point the finger at exactly who is responsible. There is a Supreme Court of Canada decision, Orphan Wells versus Grant Thornton from 2019, where the question similarly arose with who's responsible for the orphan wells left over in Alberta. The trustee in bankruptcy had a certain position, and they were saying that because the firm went bankrupt, there was no one left to require payment, essentially. And in this case, the Supreme Court of Canada found that essentially the trustee in bankruptcy was responsible for the cleanup and remediation of these sites. So it's not going to be one or the other, but as my colleague Madeleine Redfern mentioned, there is going to be responsibility on the polluter. Polluter pays principle is a very common principle in Canadian and even international law that came from 1992 summit in Rio, the World Earth Summit. But there's also needs to be some procedural safeguards within the systems designed to deliver permits to firms that conduct activity that poses a substantial risk to emission of pollutions which may impact people's health or the health of the environment as a total. I personally am a bit biased. I like the concepts of having a trust set up or something to that effect, because often these projects may span decades. So we don't know exactly when, what point in time where there's certain hazardous chemicals polluted, but there's definitely ways to figure that out, and I think that's what the purpose of this section in the bill is designed to do, to have a strategy developed in the future that will help address or help provide answers to these questions.
Satisfy you?
It does, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator McBean.
Thank you so much. Your expertise and passion here have been so informative today. And I wonder, kind of going right back to the beginning, when Mr. Smith, when you said it's a plan to make a plan, Ms. Redfern, you just were like nodding like crazy, and I wonder. Simply, and actually, I know this question is super, like, both my questions are very almost repetitive of what's going on, and I'm like, well, I'm either not listening, or I just want to hear myself talk, or I'm just trying to drill down a little more, and I'm going to hope it's the latter. But so maybe, Ms. Redfern, is S15, is this just really frustrating for you? Is this like another layer of the onion? Does it do anything for you? Like, are you just like, like, because I get at the beginning, you're like, okay, like, you know, please just meaningful inclusion when this happens, because you and your community, the Indigenous communities, are just so tired, you've said, of this, of being asked and consulted. But is it a plan to make a plan? And you're like, not another one of these. Is there a point to this for you?
Well, I was saying to Liam, and I often say to people, is that by nature I am an optimistic cynic. I've been around long enough. I'm always hopeful.
You would be perfect here in the Senate, by the way. So,
because I just don't want to be cynical only. But you know, we got to start somewhere. This is better than where we were maybe a year ago, in so much as that at least people are beginning to understand, you know, that environmental racism, you know, what is that? And, oh my God, I didn't know. And that it's not just historical, but there's historical legacies of, you know, of environmental racism. But it's also, we're making decisions now that are environmentally racist and harmful. We're trying to do good things around sort of mitigating climate change, you know, or adapting to climate change, and even some of the new technologies that we're deploying, you know, whether they are solar panels and wind turbines and, you know, small modular reactors. We're trying to get to net zero. We're going to make mistakes, but I don't think that some of the things, you know, we've thought through entirely. So, you know, to speak to, you know, a previous question is that, you know, as someone who was a former mayor, I looked into these technologies and was shocked to learn that there are toxins in solar panels, and that we have no plan in Canada as to what to properly to do with their disposal at the end of life. Like, and they cannot and should not under any circumstance be just going into our landfills as is. You know, so wind turbines, you know, again, huge amount of like land space that they're going to require when they break and or end of life, and we're not properly planning for them. Nuclear waste, of course, you know, is attempting to be addressed by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, and the Government of Canada promises that it will have a waste disposal site plan determined before, you know, the new small or micro modular reactors come online. But where does this waste end up more often than not? You know, my fear is that it's going to end up in, you know, places that are predominantly rural, remote, northern or Indigenous parts of this country. And I look to places like Europe who have imposed a tax. So the individual pays the tax up front. Same thing as what we do for batteries and tires and appliances and electronics, but we haven't done in renewable energy at the individual or commercial level. I mean, nuclear is so, you know, sort of by nature toxic that and problematic that the federal government is dealing with, you know, on our behalf. So to answer your question, you know, thank God we're starting to have this conversation, and my hope is that through the discussions that we all learn together where the problems are, that we even need an inventory of our most problematic, sort of legacy and current sort of activities or sites, and ensuring that we actually put in place a proper plan to remediate those now and or in the future, but that we're also really mindful that we are making mistakes and problems for ourselves even right now with the good intended actions in all sorts of areas.
Good intentions again. Yeah.
Do you have a supplementary?
Yes.